And should we start over here? Adam, you want to go first?
I'll go for it.
Okay.
I'm Adam Drama. I work in the FTRC at the Charter House. One word that brings me joy is walking.
I'm Jennifer Koen from the pathology department, and my one word is spring.
My name is Kayla Dietzenbach. I work in the SPAT operations management team in IT. Yeah, I kind of have to go on that line. Some warm weather would be nice. That definitely bring me joy.
I'm Lauren Nicholson with the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. One word that brings me joy, cabin.
Thanks.
I'm Amrita Prakashna, Diversity Recruitment Specialist and the Communications Chair for the Disability March. And I have to say puppy.
Yeah.
I'm Terry Norland. I'm in the Department of Laboratory Medicine. And one word of joy is grandkids.
I'm Roger Dirk. I'm with the Department of Development. My one word would be peace.
Christine Carrington. I am the Secretary of Disability Work, and I'm a return to work consultant here at the Clinic. One word today that brings me joy is family.
Josh Tripp, covering claim services as a legal consultant, and one word that brings me joy, I'd say is sports.
Yeah, my name is Andre Koen, and I'm from the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. And the one word that brings me joy is daughters.
And Sarah, will you go on the phone?
Yeah. My name is Sarah Bjorn, and I work for Cardiovascular Research Unit. And one word that brings me joy is fun.
And who else do we have on the phone? Marianne. Who else do I heard a couple other beats?
Sharon Camp.
Oh, you got Sharon.
Yep.
Okay.
So Sharon, introductions, your name, department, and one word that brings you joy.
Did you catch it? Say it one more time, Sharon.
Just waiting for your word.
Birthday.
Birthday. Got it. Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Was there anybody else on the phone? I'll just pause one more second. All right. Well, besides music and joy, we want to do a little recognition before I introduce our presenter. And I really wanted to thank members of our merge that went this past Saturday to Making Rochester Accessible. It was an event sponsored by, it was an event sponsored by the Brain Injury Committee locally, and there was partnership from StemCell, Southeast Minnesota Independent Living, as well as Maxability. And we had some great community conversations about how to make Rochester more accessible with physical space, but then also being more inclusive, and how being inclusive can make things more accessible for people psychologically. So I thought that was a good aha that came up in communication, because I think we oftentimes go to physical space when we think accessibility, but inclusion can help us make things more accessible. So recognizing Adam Drala, he was there. Sarah Bjorn helped out as a volunteer. Francie Dolan was a volunteer, and then myself and Bob Kirchner also helped out. So thank you all for doing that and helping serve lunches and doing registration. We really appreciate it. The other thing, did you know that March is Brain Injury Month? I didn't know that. And so, good, all right, Sarah, thank you, Sarah. So look for some good information in the next newsletter that will be coming out. We've got some good information on that. And if you have any ideas for our disability newsletter, be sure to contact Amrita. She'd be happy to add those in. And then lastly, April is Autism Awareness Month, and we've got a celebration with one of our own members. Francie Dolan is going to do a presentation on a harbor for neurodiversity and the learning objectives. We've got them on the flyer there, but we'll really generate awareness about autism spectrum disorders and mental illness, and identify how neurodiverse workforce can benefit the entire team, as well as developing strategies and practices that can create a disability inclusive workplace. I hear rumor there might be some music in that event as well. And we got cookies today. There might be some prizes at that event. We'll have to see. So mark April 12th on your calendar, Phillips Hall, live stream it if you can't be there in person. And we hope to see you there. So let's welcome Andre, and he's going to get us going on the unconscious bias and stereotype training.
All right.
All right.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Is there a question?
Is there a website?
Is there a web presence here for viewing? I believe that we did have that set up. I'm not sure.
Yep, we had a little technical difficulty there. Mary Ann, since you're probably at a computer, could you just email the PowerPoint to Sharon Hansen? Little teamwork there.
Yeah, we only have the PowerPoint, we won't be able to view the presenter.
You're welcome.
Please stand by while your recording connection is established.
So I'm going to record the session so that upon review, people can look at the entirety. So that's
This
what you,
conference is being recorded.
so that's what you just heard. So first of all, I'm excited to be here. We're getting feedback. Okay. This way. Okay. Is that better? Okay. I don't really need the microphone, so so there is that. So first of all, I want to say thank you so much for inviting me to have a conversation. How many folks have interacted with the unconscious bias stereotype threat units that are out there in the sphere? Okay, so I see a couple of nods and some hands. I see some blank faces, and that's cool. It's all good. It's all good. I just wanted to take the temperature of the room. So first and foremost, I walk into this room with privilege and with power. I walk into this room with privilege and power. So I'm 6'2". I'm African American. I'm a male. I'm cisgendered, which means that my gender representation is congruent with my gender identity. So I'm cisgendered. I speak English as my primary language. English is my primary language. I don't have a felony. I have matriculated through higher education, so I have initials after my last name. I'm a conservative Christian. I'm married. I'm mildly attractive, and I'm extremely humble. Right? So many of those things that I talked about as privileges are things that I walk into this room with. Many of those things are things that I've earned, and other things are things that were given to me, right? But they allow me to have privilege. So what I want you to do right now, just on the front part of your paper, is I want you to think about privileges that you have. What are some privileges that you have that have either been earned privileges or things that have been passed down to you? What are some of the privileges that you have? What might be some examples of privileges that you have? What's that? So one one person said they're not sure what I want, and I don't want anything. I want you to recognize or think about what are some privileges that you've had, and we'll define privilege in just a second. But are there some things that have made your life, your access to getting things easier rather than more difficult?
Breathing.
So breathing is one of those things, right? You may have had parents like mine. I brought you in this world, I can take you out. My parents would say things like that. So yes, breathing is one of those things. So what else is a privilege? What other privileges do you have on the phone? We'll start on the phone and then we'll come into the room. So what are some of your privileges? You can live where you want. All things considered, right? I mean, most things considered.
I'm a female.
You're a female, and in some ways that grants you some privilege, right?
Yeah.
How else? One more from the phone.
I can get education and work.
You can get medication and what?
Education.
Oh, education. So you can get education, right? So those are privileges. Do folks in the room have other privileges other than the ones that were mentioned on the phone? Yes.
A roof over my head, food to eat, and my health.
So you have your health, a roof over your head, and food to eat. Other folks? Spending money. So discretionary funds, right? What else might be a privilege?
I can drive.
You can drive, right? How many of us can drive? Even if other people don't agree with that, right? No, just teasing, just teasing, right? What are some other privileges that we might have that haven't been mentioned? Yes. The ability to see the good in things, right? Particularly from a purview of life being good, when in fact there are people who actually believe that life just is. Right? All right, yes. You have 2 great kids, right? So that's a privilege. And so what I'd like for us to think about, particularly when we think about this idea of disability, is that it is a recognition that we all have power and privilege, no matter what position we might be in, right? Simultaneously, are there ways that you have been limited by things that you may not have had control over, right? Were there ways in which you were denied access to things because you didn't have a privilege in that particular area? And what I would suggest is that there probably are areas where that has happened. So why would I start a session talking about this idea of power and privilege when we're going to start talking about implicit bias? Like, why would I do that?
Because it makes you aware of unconscious bias.
Because A, it makes you aware of unconscious bias. Secondly, what? What's another thing that I could be after by starting out with an activity like this? So looking at the limitations that one might have. Have sympathy or empathy for other people, and also have empathy for yourself. Right? Yes. I thought you were going to say, I taught middle school, so if you breathe or move, I'm calling on you. Right? That's my opportunity. Right? So yes.
But also your privilege is the lens that you look at other people through, so it affects your biases.
Yeah. So why don't people in wheelchairs just climb the steps just like I do? Because they don't have the same positionality that I have, right? The world has been organized in such a way that folks who are so-called able-bodied oftentimes don't have to think about little things. Universal design is something I'm sure we're all familiar with in some aspect. But until we start thinking with a universal design, or we have I don't know if anyone's ever twisted their ankle or broken a limb or had some kind of medical difficulty that allowed you to not be as mobile as you traditionally are, and then tried to operate in the world, right? I didn't know that my refrigerator opened from the left until I lost mobility of one of my limbs and tried to use it with the other limb, and it was awkward, right? So those kinds of things. So implicit bias or unconscious bias is really really designed to help us recognize some of our power and privilege, and then explain why other people may not have the same kinds of things that we have, right? So that's important. So we'll start with that. Also, when you heard we want to talk about unconscious bias, what kinds of things came up for you in your own thoughts or your conversations or imaginations of what we might cover in this conversation? So what were you thinking about when you heard that we'd be talking about unconscious bias? What kinds of things came up for you or are coming up for you now? What do you think that is? What's that?
Too many to mention.
It's too many things to mention?
If you're disabled but you can't see the disability, people will think that you're wired with it.
Yeah, so if you're disabled and other people can't see your disability, or sometimes maybe you don't even recognize your disability, people will say, well, what is wrong with you, right? We have to fix you or the other things. What else came up for folks as you thought about or as you're thinking about unconscious bias?
Self-examination, where am I guilty of that?
Yeah, where am I guilty of that, right? Where do I have blind spots? And so let's just dive right into this, all right? So on the front page of your paper, what I'd like for you to do is to just draw a circle. I want you to draw a circle on that front page, and it can be at least a 2-inch diameter circle, right? So at the smallest.
Somebody's struggling over here, thank you.
Just like my grandmother said, a closed mouth never gets fed, all right? So when we talk about, trying to advance the slides. Oh, cool. I think I clicked on something. All right, at any rate, so you have a circle. What I want you to do with that circle is cut yourself a piece of pie of everything. So this is the circle of all human knowledge. Everything that can be known by human beings is contained in this circle. What I want you to do is I want you to cut yourself a piece of pie the size of what you know of everything that there is to know. All right? So cut yourself a slice of pie the size of what you know of everything there is to know. All right? How big is that piece? It's pretty small, all right? Next, what I want you to do is I want you to cut yourself a second piece of pie. And this is the size of what you know that you don't know. Now, some of you will say, well, that's the rest of the pie. I want you to quantify that second piece because there's a third piece that we'll talk about, all right? So the second piece of pie is what you know you do not know. For example, I know that I don't know Mandarin Chinese. I know that I don't know American Sign Language. I know that I don't know how to fly a plane, right? So those are things that I am aware of that I do not know. All right? And what size is that piece? Is that bigger than your first piece? All right, cool. So there's things that you know, but then there's a lot more that you know you don't know. And what do you think is the last piece of that pie? What you don't know, you don't know, and we'll call that a blind spot. So write that word, blind, those two words, blind spot, in that third piece. All right? So you have what you know you don't know, and you have your blind spot. All three of these, if we put those together, we might refer to that as a paradigm. If you can write the word paradigm next to that circle. Paradigm. I used to say paradigm. I was hooked on phonics. It worked for me, right? So it is very clear that we have blind spots. And one way we can talk about those blind spots, we can talk about them as one of our biases, all right? And biases come in two forms. There are conscious bias and unconscious bias, right? The conscious bias is the easy stuff. That's the stuff we see either through social norms, through legal processes. You can't do this, you can't do that, or you can't say this or do that. We understand what those kinds of things are, right? Unconscious bias are those things that we are unaware of. Now, one thing we must recognize is that we all have bias because we all have these blind spots, right? But just because I have the blind spots doesn't mean that I have to stay with all of those blind spots. Because we are human beings, we can use our metacognition. We are Homo sapiens sapiens, the ones who know they exist, right? So we can use our metacognition to uncover our unconscious bias. And so, I think everybody has a copy but me. Let me grab my, oh, here's mine. So, one of the things that you'll see if you haven't experienced this unconscious bias learning unit is that there are three scenarios that they present us with. One is with William, the other one is with Sandy, and lastly is with Kate. And so we'll talk about some of these types of biases, right? So William, Jane, and Kate. So I'm sorry, it was Jane. William, Jane, and Kate. So William, colleagues consistently focused on the problems in his research, more than they did for any others. This is affecting his morale and his perception of being valued by others. The unconscious bias is this unconscious thinking systems were shaped by a lifetime of exposure to images that reinforce the untrue racist stereotype that Black people are less competent. The impact on William is such that we can unintentionally judge the work of some people more favorably than the work of other people without being aware of it, all right? There are a lot of other factors that could play into this, but we just want to talk about one of the unconscious bias. So if you could go to the handout that I gave you, and what you'll find there on that second page is a graph. And what I want you to do with this graph is to tell me what the folks on the groups on the left of that graph taught you about the groups across the top. So there are primarily in this learning unit, three groups that were addressed, and we'll talk about those. So what I'd like for you to do is to tell me what your parents and family taught you about African Americans, women in leadership, or people who are perceived to be obese, and what have they taught you about people like yourself? What did your friends teach you about each of those categories? What did TV and movies teach you about each of those categories? And what does school and workplace teach you about those categories? But I want you to do it in a particular kind of way. If it was something positive that these groups on the left said, I want you to put a plus in the corresponding box. If it was something negative that someone in those boxes said, I want you to put a minus. If it was never anything that had been discussed, I want you to put a 0. All right? So pluses, minuses, and zeros in each of the corresponding boxes. You can have pluses and minuses in the same box, but their size matters. So big plus, lots of positive, a little minus means a little bit of negative. All right? Pluses, minuses, and zeros. I'll give you about another minute or so. 4, 3, 2, 1, and what I'd like for you to do is at your tables, I would like for you to share what you want to share. And don't share what you don't want to share. But I'll give, it looks like there's about 3 people to a table roughly. So I'll give about 3 minutes for discussion. That's roughly about a minute apiece. So please talk about your pluses, minuses, and zeros. All right? So you have 3 minutes starting now.
Women in leadership in the 60s, wasn't really a topic at home. Friends that I'd be a male in my entire career, positive that best experiences as a woman, and really taught me at an early age what that was probably the negative things like obesity. Too much.
I feel my mom, you know, she's always, you know, she's always been the top she worked
It's really hard to
at one,
I've had a lot more
throughout the years.
and like I get a person to do media
I
So we don't, like, I think we don't.
so it's kind
We kind of see it, but we don't really know that much.
yeah, like for myself, I feel like that I don't think about it, it's like yeah. But I mean, there were times like even that, like I was kind of, I feel like lost myself, creating more negative within myself. So again, that's where those perception of like something that brings that yeah, right. That determination, yeah. I totally see
And it's very hard when I hear the talk about, there's not my.
I mean,
Because, you know, that's kind of my heart is in my hand, and like, you know, they might hear it, they might hear their feelings, so. I really want to.
4, 3, 2, 1, and so before I use the word paradigm, and I don't know that I spent much time helping to define that word. Have people heard that word before, paradigm? Right? And when people use the word paradigm, what context do they usually use it in? When people say paradigm, what are they talking about? Yes, you'll hear people. How many people, raise your hand if you heard people say we need to change our paradigm or shift our paradigm, right? So what do they mean by that? So what is it? Is a paradigm a chair that we need to move across the room? Is it a table? When they're using that and using context clues, what are they meaning by that?
Lens is what I thought I was doing. How you're looking at that.
How you're looking at something, right? And so a paradigm is simply how you see the world. And how you see the world will dictate what it is that you see, right? We don't see the world as it is. We see the world as we are, right? So I'm at a point where I need corrective lenses. And if I don't have those corrective lenses, I don't see the world rightly, right? All things considered. So when we think about this, these pluses, minuses, and zeros, I don't want to know what you have pluses, minuses, and zeros on. It's none of my business. This is a personal assessment that you share with people at your table. But I do have a question. Is it possible that the people who have given us information about these groups could have helped set a paradigm for us? Is it possible that there could be a paradigm set for us? All right, cool. And when is a paradigm shift necessary? So why have these organizations talked about we need a paradigm shift? We need to change our paradigm. What is the impetus for that?
At the basic level, when something's not working.
Right. So when something's not working, we need a change, right? So when our ideas that have been given to us by these things aren't working, then we need to change them. But if they are working, what? We don't need to change, right? And so what we've said, particularly as a part of our climate assessment, is that unconscious bias is one of those paradigms that we must change because it is causing us harm, right? Both in terms of morale and other things. So what I want you to think about as you look at this is many of these things we will look at and say, it is not my fault that I was in this particular situation, or I was exposed to information, or I didn't have a lack of that, right? I grew up in a rural part of the state. There weren't many people of this group or that group around. That is not my fault. And I will concede with you that that is absolutely true. It is not your fault. But how many of you drive a car or are ridden in a car? Does that car have blind spots? And typically, where are those blind spots? So right at your shoulders, behind you, in those crossbars. And if you drive a Hummer, the whole thing is a blind spot, right? Are those blind spots your fault? They are not your fault, but you do have to watch out for them. They are your responsibility. And so although we have this matrix that we created, and we may have some minuses or we may have some zeros, and many of those things are not our fault. Now that we're at the age of accountability, it then becomes our responsibility to do something with those things. All right? So cool. So that's the part with William. There's some reflection questions, and these things are online for you to explore and use with your own groups. Next is Jane. Jane is worried that she was too assertive in advocating for her promotion, and that she would be labeled as pushy or bossy. So she doesn't want to ask for promotion because she doesn't want to be seen in a negative light. The unconscious bias that she's up against is the sexist stereotype that women should be submissive and focus on family because of the negative emotional reactions to Jane's assertiveness, right? So that's what she's up against. That's the unconscious bias. The impact is that even those who are competent, who are committed to women's equality and equal opportunity can still unconsciously penalize women for prioritizing career / over family, right? So on the second page in your handout, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I just want you to think about this. There are two columns. There's women and girls, and there's boys and men. And what I'd like for you to do is to take each one of those words and put them in one category or not, and then check if that is a positive attribute or a negative attribute. All right? So aggressive, does that go on the women's side or the men's side? And is that a positive or a negative? Being assertive, is that on the men's side or the women's side? And is that a positive or a negative? Compassionate, is that on the men's side or so forth and so on? Effective, leader, stylish, wholesome, submissive. however you want to do it. Her question in the room was, is this what you think or is this what society thinks? And I would say, however you want to approach this is correct, is a correct approach. So stop right there just for a second, because I think the point has been made. What do we recognize about all of those things? There are two sides of it, right? And what else about that?
Well, for aggressive, it would be negative, and, maybe that would be a man could be seen as assertive and a woman could be seen as aggressive, but they're both the same.
They're both
negative stereotypes.
Yeah. So if you haven't picked up the secret, each one of those are paired sets of words of the same activity. That aggressive and assertive are the same thing, but we call it different things, right? They manifest differently. Compassionate and emotional are the same thing, but they show up differently depending on how we want to put people into our gender categories. Wholesome and submissive, right? I mean, so these are paired words. And so we have to recognize that oftentimes we have double standards. That what is, so we have double standards. And please raise your hand if you've ever been caught in a situation of a double standard, where you were held to a set of policies or things, and then other people were held to or allowed to do the same things you weren't allowed to do. Right? So we've all been caught in these double standards. And does that increase effectiveness or does that decrease effectiveness? It in fact decreases effectiveness, right? So the last piece in this presentation is dealing with Kate. And Kate's issue is that her physician has been treating her differently since he noticed some weight gain, right? The physician has noticed some weight gain and he's been treating her differently. So what I'd like you to do is to count the triangles in this diagram. Please count the triangles in this diagram. And shout out a number. When you get a number, shout it out. 10. I got 10 triangles. Is there another number? 2 triangles. You have 11 triangles. You said what? You said 6 triangles. There was another number, Yo? No? Okay. 8. In fact, how many? So first of all, what constitutes a triangle? Let's talk about that first. What is a triangle? It has 3. It is a shape that has 3 sides. Are there any shapes in this diagram that have 3 sides? No. So how many triangles are there? There are 0. And so one of the things that Kate's doctor was doing was he was attributing, he had a bias in working with her because he was attributing her weight gain with not being healthy. And those things are not necessarily in sync or aligned. And so one of the things that we recognize is that oftentimes we can add things to the situation that aren't there because that's our bias. And so obesity or being overweight, and you'll see in the graph I said people who appear to be overweight, right? I don't know exactly what the BMI index is for everybody in all their situations. So I can't be the person who says this particular person is or is not blah, 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 blah. But I also know that there are some people who are very thin who are not healthy, right? So equating health with size is not necessarily a direct ratio. And so as we think about our interactions with clients, with our coworkers, with patience. We have to recognize that it's our bias, the stories that we have in our head, that oftentimes impact how we're able to give them service. And if we're not checking for our blind spots, there are two ways to find out about blind spots in a car. And what are they? You can look first, or you what? You have an accident, right? And so I would prefer that we look first rather than having those accidents. Yes?
The last time we discussed this exercise, we used the word illusion, and I think that runs home to run through with me is we have this internal dialogue with ourselves and this illusion of what we think it should look like, and I think that's a great point.
We don't see the world as it is. We see the world as we are. My name is Andre Koen. Thank you so much for your time. This has been a wonderful opportunity. So.
I wish I had a song after this, because that was awesome.
Thank you.
You know, I think we did the tolerance activity in January. We have this foundation in, February, and this foundation in March. It will help us through our